In this lecture, we're going to talk about personality and dissociative disorders. Personality disorders include 10 diagnosable psychiatric conditions that are recognized and described in the DSM-5. Each is a distinct mental illness defined by personality traits that can be troubling enough to create problems with relating to other people in healthy ways and can lead to significant distress or impairment in important areas of functioning. Roughly 10% of the general population and up to about half of psychiatric patients in clinical settings have a personality disorder. Although experts do not fully understand the causes of personality disorders, they believe that both genetic and environmental factors play a role. Roughly 50% of personality disorders are attributed to genetic factors and family history. Genetic vulnerabilities may make people more susceptible to these conditions, while experience and other environmental factors may act as a trigger in the development of a personality disorder. There's also a significant association between a history of childhood trauma as well as verbal abuse. One study found that children who experienced verbal abuse were 3 times more likely to have borderline, narcissistic, obsessive compulsive, or paranoid personality disorders in adulthood. High reactivity in children, including sensitivity to light, noise, texture, and other stimuli, has also been linked to certain disorders. Personality disorders are organized into 3 groups or clusters based on shared key features, which we'll talk about next. These personality disorders in cluster A are characterized by odd or eccentric behavior. So people with cluster A personality disorders tend to experience major disruptions in relationships because their behavior may be perceived as peculiar, suspicious, or detached. So these include paranoid personality disorder, which affects between 2.3 to 4.4% of adults in the US. Symptoms include chronic pervasive distrust of other people, suspicion of being deceived or exploited by others, including friends, family, and partners. Schizoid personality disorder is characterized by social isolation and indifference towards other people. It affects slightly more men than women. People with this disorder are often described as cold or withdrawn. They rarely have close relationships with others and may be preoccupied with introspection and fantasy. Schizotypal personality disorder features odd speech, behavior, and appearance, as well as strange beliefs and difficulty forming relationships. The cluster B personality disorders are characterized by dramatic or erratic behavior. People who have a personality disorder from this cluster tend to experience very intense emotions or engage in extremely impulsive, theatrical, promiscuous, or law-breaking behaviors. There's antisocial personality disorder, which tends to show up in childhood, unlike most other personality disorders, which don't become apparent until adolescence or young adulthood. Symptoms include a disregard for rules and social norms and a lack of remorse for other people. Borderline personality disorder is characterized by instability in interpersonal relationships, emotions, self-image, and impulsive behaviors. Histrionic personality disorder features excessive emotionality and attention seeking that often leads to socially inappropriate behaviors to get attention. And narcissistic personality disorder, which is associated with self-centeredness, exaggerated self-image, lack of empathy for others, and is often driven by an underlying fragility in the sense of self. Cluster C are characterized by anxiety. So people with personality disorders in this cluster tend to experience pervasive anxiety or fearfulness. Avoidant personality disorder is a pattern of social inhibition and avoidance fueled by fears of inadequacy and criticism. Dependent personality disorder involves fear of being alone and often causes those who have the disorder to do things to try to get other people to help take care of them. An obsessive compulsive personality disorder is characterized by a preoccupation with orderliness, perfection, and control. Though similarly named, it is not the same as obsessive compulsive disorder. So I have a video here about what it's like inside a for somebody with bipolar personality disorder inside one of their episodes. I will skip that though for the sake of time. Dissociation, moving on now to dissociative disorders. Dissociation is a disconnect between a person's sensory experience, thoughts, sense of self, or personal history. People may feel a sense of unreality and lose their connection to time, place, and identity. Dissociation disrupts 4 areas of personal functioning that usually operate together smoothly, automatically, and with few or no problems. And so these 4 are consciousness, identity, memory, self-awareness, and awareness of surroundings. Breaks in this system of automatic functions cause the symptoms of dissociation, which can range from a mild sense of detachment to a more severe disconnection from reality. There are 3 types. Depersonalization derealization disorder involves feeling detached from one's own body and thoughts. So people may feel like they're observing their own life as an outsider or feel disconnected from their surroundings. Dissociative amnesia is characterized by forgetting personal information and memories of events. And then dissociative identity disorder. This was previously known as multiple personality disorder, but has since been renamed. It's marked by having 2 or more persistent personality states. All 3 disorders have a central feature of dissociation, or a disruption in the normally integrated functions of consciousness, memory, identity, and perception. Let's talk a little more about dissociative identity disorder, or DID, as it's the most common of the dissociative disorders. DID is marked by the presence of 2 or more distinct personalities existing within one individual. A person with DID will experience the presence of 2 or more distinct personalities or identities, also known as alters. These personalities recurrently take control of the person's behavior, and they often experience a loss of memory of what happened while another personality or alter was in control. Each alter has a distinct set of traits, personal history, and way of relating to the world. These alters may have different names, mannerisms, genders, and preferences than the individual's core personality. People with DID may also lack the ability to recall childhood memories and personal history. They may have feelings of detachment or disconnection, or thoughts of harm or suicide. Although some have described DID as a rare condition, a combination of prevalence studies indicate that 1 to 1.5% of the population may have the disorder. There's long been controversy within the field of mental health about whether or not DID actually exists. So there is evidence that people with DID are more susceptible to hypnosis and suggestibility, which has led some experts to argue that the separate identities experienced by people with DID may simply be the result of suggestion. Other experts, however, point to studies which demonstrate that the different personalities of a person with DID have different physiological profiles, including different brain activity patterns or cardiovascular responses. So these studies have been used as evidence for the existence of alters. So overall, DID remains a somewhat controversial diagnosis, but it is gaining more acceptance in the mental health community. There's a ton of media coverage of DID. It's really interesting and gives you a lot to think about in terms of movie plots and characters. So consider movies like Fight Club, Raising Cain, etc. But my favorite example is from Lord of the Rings, with Smeagol or Gollum, who clearly shows 2 distinct personalities existing in one body. So let's take a look at this scene where we can see the 2 different personalities. They're actually interacting with one another, which is not a super accurate portrayal. You typically wouldn't see that, but it's media, so they took some liberties. So that's Smeagol. And there's Gollum.
We must get it back. Patience. Patience, my love. First, we must lead them to her. To the one star. Yes. Stars again. Up the stairs we go. Until we come to the tunnel. There's no coming out. She's always hungry. That doesn't taste very nice, does it, Precious? Not very nice at all. She hungers for sweeter meats, hobbit meat. When she throws away the bones and empties
Sorry, my mouse wasn't working. So I like this example because it clearly shows the two different personalities of Gollum and Smeagol that are existing in one body. I have a video here about dissociative disorders. I'm not going to show it, it's a little bit long, but it gives some really interesting information about causes and symptoms and prevalence rates. So you can check that out on your own. Moving on to schizophrenia, which is a type of mental illness that affects how the brain works. So this leads to chronic problems with disordered thoughts and behaviors. It usually requires lifelong care and treatment. Researchers estimate that schizophrenia affects approximately 0.3 to 0.7% of people. Schizophrenia affects people from all racial backgrounds and ethnicities, although it's slightly more common in men than women. Two of the major categories of schizophrenia symptoms are positive and negative. Now, think back to when we talked about learning and behavior, and I said this positive and negative is not about good and bad. It's rather the way that the symptoms present. So as with learning and behavior, positive symptoms are additive problems, something that's added to the environment. They're positive in the sense that they represent an addition to someone's typical day-to-day experience, things like hallucinations, delusions, and disorganized thinking or speech. So during a hallucination, a person hears, sees, feels, or smells something that's not there. Most often, this occurs in the form of hearing voices that others don't hear. These voices may be reassuring, threatening, or anywhere in between. Sometimes a person experiences these only as intrusive thoughts, but sometimes they seem to come from outside the self. Delusions are false beliefs held by a person that are not shared by other people. So someone with a delusion has a very fixed view of a situation and typically can't be talked out of it with reason. For example, someone with schizophrenia might believe that they are the subject of a government conspiracy or that aliens are monitoring their activities. People with disorganized speech may be difficult to understand because their sentences may be unconnected, or the person is frequently switching topics in a way that just doesn't make sense to the listener. Although the speech likely has meaning for the individual in a way that's connected to some sort of internal experience. Characteristics that seem to be absent or diminished in someone with schizophrenia are negative symptoms. This includes things like decreased emotional expression and lack of initiation in goal-directed activities. People may also have additional cognitive symptoms like difficulty concentrating, remembering, or planning activities. People with schizophrenia often show poor self-care, poor interpersonal, school, or career functioning. The illness makes it really challenging for them to join in social events, as well as to participate in meaningful relationships. This week's quiz code is FLOWER. Early theorists mistakenly laid the blame for schizophrenia on mothers. They thought schizophrenic mothers were the culprits for why people develop schizophrenia. This has long since been debunked, but families may play some role in determining whether schizophrenic patients relapse. A number of schizophrenic patients are institutionalized, and transitioning out of hospitals and back into the community can be especially challenging. Family members may influence whether they may relapse through expressed emotion, which is criticism or hostility or over-involvement in the person's life, and it varies across ethnic groups. The effects of expressed emotion tend to be positively correlated with relapse rates among Caucasians, but not in Mexican or African American families. Psychosocial factors play a role in schizophrenia, but are only triggered in people with genetic vulnerabilities. It's highly heritable, and an identical twin of someone with schizophrenia is about 3 times more likely to develop it than a fraternal twin, and about 50 times more likely than average. Research that indicates that one or more of the fluid-filled structures, called ventricles, which cushion and nourish the brain, are typically enlarged in people with schizophrenia. Schizophrenia is also associated with increased sulci, or spaces between the ridges in the brain, and decreases activation of the amygdala and hippocampus. fMRI studies show that when given an active task, the frontal lobes of people with schizophrenia are less activated than those without it. This is known as hypofrontality. There's also some differences in neurotransmitters. So the dopamine hypothesis suggests that most anti-schizophrenic drugs block dopamine receptor sites. Stimulants that block the reuptake of dopamine tend to make the symptoms of schizophrenia worse. So dopamine likely plays a role in schizophrenia. And I meant to point this chart out earlier, but this shows the heritability or the genetic connection. So we see at the bottom, these are the people who are more closely related. So as we go up, the connection between the schizophrenic individual and others gets lower and lower. So we're talking about the general population, then spouses where there's no genetic association, first cousins, aunts and uncles, grandchildren, moving all the way down to monozygotic twins. Okay, so you see as the individual gets closer and closer, for the most part, the rate of lifetime risk of developing schizophrenia increases. So it's pretty strong evidence for at least some genetic factors that are associated. All right, so in the last lecture for this week, we'll talk about some disorders that commonly occur in childhood.